Hello and welcome to Business Today Television. I am Siddharth Zarabi and you're watching Easynomics. On the show today, we discuss China's deflation. Yes, you heard that right. China is deflating. And the questions that we ask, the big one really is whether India can benefit from the ongoing downturn in the world's second largest economy. Beijing's troubles have increased due to the unprecedented move by President Joe Biden virtually just a day ago, who has announced a long-expected executive order that curbs fresh US technology investment in China. Viewers, this is the first time that the United States is imposing a restriction on American capital flowing out of the country. Hasn't happened, and at least not in this manner ever before. And more such measures could be in store where America targets China. This is a clear signal that China is no longer a clear-cut option for American capital, and the favor seems to be over of some decades ago. And joining me to decode the bad news for Beijing and its troubles are Professor Srikanth Kondapalli, Dean of the School of International Studies, and Robinder Sachdev, President, Imagindia Institute. Thank you very much for joining us today. Professor Kondapalli, I come to you first, sir, to put this in context. COVID emanating from China, at least there's no debate about that, and a situation where the whole world suffered economically, but much of the world has come out of the worst of the economic issues that started with COVID. But China seems to be slipping and slipping continuously. What is really going on in China? Go ahead, Professor Kondapalli.
Thank you for having me in this show. I think there is a substantial decline in GDP growth rate over a period of time. In the 1990s, China grew around 12%, and in 1 year at 14%. And that declined to about 10% annual growth rate in 2010, and now last year to 3.3% growth rate. This year it is expected by the Premier, initially Li Keqiang and now Li Qiang, they mentioned about 5.5% growth rate for 2023. However, the PMI, manufacturing index, is relatively low, below 50 points, where the problem of economic growth rates become very acute. So the GDP decline is the most important one, because since the reform began, China had been articulating about GDP growth rate, sometimes at the cost of the social sector. So key problem here is the GDP. As the Tiananmen Square incident indicated, the Chinese Communist Party made a deal with the people on economic growth rates. That is number one. Economic growth rate decline meant there is also problems that you have just mentioned, the deflationary pressures and so on. But in terms of the social sector, the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences once made a survey and concluded that for every 1% decline in growth rate, there are 8 million unemployed, or the layoffs. One of the effects of deflation is also the labor layoffs, workers' layoffs, creating unemployment. So today, various estimates are made on unemployment. It is argued that it is about 21% unemployment, youth unemployment in China today. And some Chinese economists say this figure can go up to actually 44% of the unemployment. So that is the bad news, because the social sector is the worst that has been affected with, as you mentioned, the COVID-19 related lockdowns and others, which created this spiral. The long-term effect of this is how China can get out of the middle income trap. As you know, there are over 116 countries which have not been able to pass through the middle income trap. China today has about $11,000 per capita. And if they do not increase the per capita as a result of the economic growth rate decline, it is easier for China to go through this middle income trap. So that is a long-term problem. In addition, of course, to the unemployment, the layoffs, and the growth rates decline, and so on. Siddharth?
In fact, viewers, let me also take you through some of these other numbers and this rather unprecedented statement by a US president saying that China is a ticking time bomb. You know, it's not just reflective of geopolitical tensions and the rivalry between the world's largest economy and the second largest 15 trillion odd dollars economy. And like the professor just said, a weak growth, but let's take a look at some of these numbers once again and let's bring up those charts. China GDP growth, look at the trend. If you look at the 5 quarters of data that we have here, the first quarter of FY23 minus 1.9%, the second quarter we saw 3.2%, 0.45% in the third, 2.2 in the fourth, and the first quarter we've seen a sharp decline. Now you look at consumer prices. If we move to the next one, the CPI trend in China, March, April, May, June, July, 5-month data. Again, this 5-month data will show you what's happening. In fact, July has been a slight uptick, but 4 consecutive months, and this data is captured on an annual basis. So that also tells you something. Again, a quick look through once at the export numbers. The export and the manufacturing powerhouse of the global economy, China, and a journey that began well over 3 decades ago, now seems to be sputtering. It's not to say that we can write off China so easily and so fast despite everything, but look at that. Look at the export data, and that shows you export decline is consistent, and between March and July it's a reverse flip. March had close to 15% exports. July has close to almost a 15% dip in exports. And youth unemployment, those numbers and the concern that Professor Kondapalli spoke about, the July numbers, viewers, are expected to be even higher than the record 21% that have been spoken about for the first quarter. And clearly, policymakers in China don't seem to have answers to this problem. Youth unemployment has doubled in the last 4 years. Robinder, Sachdev, I'm coming to you with that very same question. Put this entire basket of economic woes in context, and if you want to add something about the likely consequences in societal terms that this communist dictatorship nation with capitalist features that China really is. Robinder, Sachdev.
So, thank you so much, and honor to be with you and Professor Srikanth. See, in a few bullet ways, simplified, one could look at this way. China is right now in a deflation. Okay, it's temporary, maybe. How long it goes, we don't know. But remember the deflation of Japan in the 90s, which led entire decade as a lost decade to Japan. China is not there yet, but there are those parallels being talked about into the future. But what does deflation mean? Deflation basically would mean the opposite of inflation, which means that prices of goods within China are falling. Now, why are the prices falling? It means either consumers are not buying or buyers are not coming forward to buy what's there in the market, or there's an oversupply of the goods in the market. There are too many goods and, consumers are not enough again. So that's the scenario which seems bottom line right now with regards to deflation. Prices going down because buyers are not buying. One. Second, you mentioned about, Xi Jinping. So I'll kind of touch on it a bit. When Xi Jinping came to his third term in the Congress last year, the 7-member Politburo, I think, is heavily stacked only with people of national security backgrounds. There is no one, or maybe only one, someone who has a deep background in economics. That to some observers indicated then and indicates now maybe that Xi Jinping is laying a higher priority to issues of national security and all around whatever it be as compared to economics, though I would say that definitely any leader would want a better economy, because the better your economy, the more you have money for other things, whatever, including defense. So that's out there, as a question. Thirdly, with respect to the US and Biden saying, as you said, that China is a ticking time bomb, absolutely is. It's not only China, it's US and China who are together a ticking time bomb in the next maybe 5 odd years or so. All US or several US, scenario war modeling exercises are projecting that 2027 or thereabouts would be a time when China would take action whichever way with regards to Taiwan. And also, it is a window of time. You see, now America is racing. As you mentioned, they've put a stop to capital inflows or venture capital, private equity into China. It's never before happened, right? Yes, before this, what America was already doing was had imposed sanctions on technologies and banned American citizens from working in the Chinese semiconductor industry. So that was already going on to, kind of close the tap for China to access technologies and talent. But now even the money is being, stopped whatever America can. The key thing is that it is a race. It's not only a war, it is a race between China and the US to kind of become the leaders in the technologies of the future, be it AI, quantum computing, etc. So that's where it's heading with respect to, the competition. But yes, this means that American investments, as you mentioned, China plus one is there, would now be looking for alternative markets. We can come to that a bit later with regards to India. But within China, and with this deflation, the reports today which are out there is of the property, not to say bubble, but property market, whichever way.
It's been actually more than a bubble. In fact, that's a good point to bring up. Let's bring up some pointers about what is happening in the property market in China. The China property market has been for years, viewers, the fastest growing property market both for commercial and residential anywhere across the globe. And if you look at it in broader terms, in terms of the infrastructure development that has happened in China, it clearly surpasses any other country by leaps and bounds. But over the last 2-3 years, and in fact even earlier, some of the largest property companies in China have faced trouble, and the latest is a Evergrande-like crisis for a group called Country Garden. And this is a company that has missed interest payments, and if it were to default, it would have a much broader impact across the housing market. Home prices have already declined 20%, and housing for any economy, any fast developing major economy in the world, including the United States, is a very, very significant sector. It's a barometer of any national economy, because all manner of commodity inputs and services revolve around housing, real estate, and the broader infrastructure piece. And if there's a problem there, it then has a ripple effect through the system. Professor Kondapalli, be that as it may, the question that I want to ask you, and taking off from a comment that Robinder Sachdev also made, does Xi Jinping not know how to run China's economy, or is he simply not focused on it, and does he sort of enjoy being the head of a band of wolf warriors really in some ways?
As you rightly mentioned, Siddharth, there is a paradigm shift from last 30 years of reform to the last decade of Xi Jinping's rule. Last three decades of reform had the strategic guiding principle of what the Chinese call Tao Guang Yang Hui. That is, hide your capabilities, bide for your time, or sometimes translated as keeping a low profile but focusing on economy. So from 78 to 2012, they focused on economy and did not raise much of the security issues other than Taiwan or other sovereignty issues. However, when Xi Jinping came to power, he used the words "fanfa your way," roughly translated as accomplishing something. So the the interpretation of this is they're moving away from economic growth rates to that of assertion, China's role in global affairs. That was the focus of Xi Jinping. And we saw grand programs like Belt and Road Initiative launched in 2013. They also had this concept of China Dream. Basically, the lands that China perceived to have lost in 19th century, 18th century, today they want these lands to be back to China. That had pitched China to many states like Vietnam, Philippines, Arunachal Pradesh, Senkaku Islands, or others. So basically, there is a paradigm shift from economics to that of core interests, as they call, focusing on sovereignty and territorial integrity, and as you rightly mentioned, on security related. As you mentioned, the Politburo Standing Committee of 7 members, uh, 5 of them are with Xi Jinping, and even the rest of two, Chao Lachi and Wang Huning, they also side with Xi Jinping now. They sided with others before, but now it is. So there is an overwhelming support for Xi Jinping in the Politburo Standing Committee, which was kind of tailor made. And then the other factional leaders were either thrown out or neglected in the decision making process. In the Politburo, there is a decline from 24 to 25 to 24, where Hu Chunhua was dropped from the Politburo membership. Hu Chunhua was the agriculture in charge in the previous term of the 19th Communist Party Congress. And his briefing was how to keep the pork prices constant because that is the staple diet in China. However, he is now removed and he is part of the consultative body called the CPPCC. Uh, with this, there is a lot of discontent, number one, within the industry and commerce. Number two is the Xi Jinping's recent slogan 3 years ago of common prosperity. As a Beijing economics professor mentioned, it is robbing the rich and giving it to the poor, to the peasantry and others. So, as a result, the big business like Alibaba, Tencent, Meituan, other companies suffered. They now have to pay $10 billion each or even more to the Common Prosperity Fund, which meant that the big businesses are now getting their slack. And this has resulted in a lot of discontent in the industry and commerce. There are other curbs on the economy, and hence overall situation is that, and the speculation is that Xi Jinping has crossed the limits by shifting from economics to that of security, national security. And the 14th five-year plan and previously the 13th five-year plan, they started focusing more on restructuring the economy towards domestic consumption and focusing on imports rather than exports. So this created also some kind of turbulence in the economic structure, and that is also is said to be the basis for the economic decline that China currently faces. So there are a lot of issues like this, and you rightly also mentioned about the real estate crash, Evergrande and other companies. Their shares have fallen in Hang Seng, in Hong Kong Stock Exchange. Their borrowing from external sources has declined. FDI also has declined. Round tripping, many Chinese businesses do through Hong Kong and other places, that has also declined due to the curbs that were imposed by the government on the economic, sector. Um, I'm mentioning real estate because at one time or on a regular basis, China used to give 11% of its GDP for the local governments, mainly in the infrastructure projects, real estate, or others. 11% of $19 trillion, the GDP of China, that's a humongous amount, which has now gone into a decline. So this has created a huge problem at the economic level. I think these are the basic problems that China is currently facing. I would say the paradigm shift from economic reform to that of accomplishing something, as Xi Jinping mentioned, is at the roots of this current decline.
Absolutely. Professor Kondapalli, you touch on several points in that answer. And uh, when I first visited China, viewers, that is when I first learned the meaning of what used to be said those days, that the national bird of China was a crane. And this was a crane that you would see in every single city, including Beijing, with multiple ring roads. And till the eye could see, you would only see construction cranes. I hope you didn't think about the bird. And today, if you see the situation in China, here's what Morgan Stanley has said in the most recent report, because we now will try and focus on what it means for India. We've decoded the troubles in China. Morgan Stanley, the investment bank, has downgraded China and has upgraded India. Now, see the significance of this. For the last couple of years, global leaders, global CEOs, they've all been talking about India plus one. And that plus one mostly meant India. China plus one mostly meant India. And in certain pockets, it also meant some other countries. But what has Morgan Stanley said? It has upgraded India to overweight from equal. It has downgraded China to equal weight rating. Downgrades for China till a few years ago were completely unimaginable. India has, by the way, risen 5 ranks in the process in the Morgan Stanley view of things. India is now the most preferred market among emerging markets. And Morgan Stanley says India at the start of a long wave boom, China at the end of one. And of course, India's reform stability, the political stability, corporate profits, very strong focus on capital expenditure, primarily by the central government and also by the states, point towards the fact that we will continue to have one of the strongest GDP growth rates anywhere in the world. Robinder, I'm coming to you. US putting fresh curbs, domestic problems, a crackdown on high tech, and other systemic issues in China. Is this an opportunity for India, a fresh one?
Thank you. Absolutely. And maybe I think the operative word here you used is a fresh one. This is China plus one and now a fresh one, right? Definitely it's an opportunity for India, but there are a couple of things to note also. You see, when China goes down, by the way, our exports go down also. China imports, I think, about 70% of its iron ore imports from India. So some of those import-export numbers would also, be pulled down. But otherwise, yes, it is definitely an opportunity for India. At the same time, we have to step forward and take chance of it and grab it. Couple of reasons. One, in terms of China plus one or other relocation of supply chains out of China, Vietnam is a strong competitor and so is Malaysia. India is emerging. Where we have, I think, a better handle is that we are ourselves a big market. So if, let's say, a large American manufacturer uses Vietnam, they'll use it only for a manufacturing to export to someone else. Vietnam market itself is too small a market. Whereas in India, if companies are there, they have a big market in India itself. So that's an advantage we have. One more thing I would add to this whole thing with respect to India. investments would come into India, definitely. But let's remember the world of today is now very different than the world of 1990s when China grew massively. Now, investments will not yield that many number of jobs in the manufacturing sector as it would have yielded back in 90s. Just imagine, a car automotive plant, a Toyota or a Ford or a GM, right, would maybe, employ 5,000 workers way back in 90s. Today, maybe the same plant, the same capex. Yes, the capital expense capex could be the same coming in, but could create maybe only 100 jobs because everything is automotive. So therefore, investments will come, could come. We have to, I think, step up and make efforts, but also we should not be not complacent, but I think we are, of course, nobody is, that investments into India will convert into more jobs and employment. There will be a gap. India cannot repeat what China and the world had in the 90s and
Okay.
2000s and last 30 odd years.
Okay, that's a good point. Professor Kondapalli, I turn to you in the context of the latest move by President Joe Biden. The US has prohibited investment in sensitive technology. This focuses on semiconductor chips, on quantum computing, artificial intelligence, and also put on a approval list other tech funding. And this has meant that US private equity and venture fund investments into China are at an 8-year low. Now, in the broader scheme of things, specifically, we've also been trying our own efforts to boost manufacturing. We've seen some results. Do you actually see the fresh curbs resulting in a shift towards India, a further shift and significant investments in some of these sectors, or will this US money and interest go elsewhere in the world?
It is likely that India would be a big gainer in this process of the decoupling or de-risking that has been mentioned between United States and China. You did mention about the semiconductor ban, the chips ban to China in October last year, $130 billion ban on Huawei and ZTE Chongqing. Secondly, the second round of curbs that have been announced by the Biden administration. This is despite the visits of Blinken, Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, and Kissinger in quick succession in the last 2 months. Despite that, there has been no Chinese, plan B on this, and they continue with tariffs on American products as a part of the Trump administration policies in 2017 and 18. So the retaliatory tariff measures has vitiated the atmosphere between US and China, and it appears that there is no way back on that front. However, it is important to note that United States has about 77,000 companies working in China in the manufacturing sector and service sector. They have nearly $700 billion investment in the China market. And China is trying to put pressure on the White House through these companies. So the decoupling process has not yet begun in terms of these manufacturing sector industries moving away to a third market. We have seen some 200 companies out of these 77,000 companies moving to the Indian market, but that is not enough. Likewise, Japanese companies, Japan, I'm mentioning because of the alliances with the United States, they have 87,000 companies in China, and hardly any companies moved into the Indian market. So globally, there is a certain pro-China position by these multinational corporations. So barring this factor, it appears that the signaling has been very conducive for India in terms of picking up the Atmanirbhar campaign and Sagarmala, and of course the Digital India, the other campaigns that we launched some years ago. The recent visit by Prime Minister Modi to the United States also should be seen because, as you mentioned about quantum computing, this is the second most important aspect of the Quad. Uh, Initially, it is the vaccines, but second, it is the critical technologies, including quantum computing. Third is in the maritime domain. So it is likely that the United States suggestion to include these should be seen in the larger picture of diverting towards Indian market rather than towards that of China. So I think this
A
is
quick follow-up.
beneficial for India.
A quick follow-up. While it certainly seems to be beneficial on paper, do you think because of the vice-like grip that China continues to still have on the global supply chain, and it's a massive grip, like iron ore, 70% of India's iron ore exports go to China. The same thing happens all over the world, and China controls the final product. Do you think China will allow this shift of capital, technology and interest to move to India? And can we also expect more trouble on our border as a result, a sort of proxy action by China?
I think that is a good angle to look at. The COVID-related disruptions in supply chain is one of the worst things that have happened. However, please remember that India signed an agreement with Australia and Japan for the Supply Chain Resilience Initiative Act. And for the past 2 years, they are looking at how to digitalize trade aspects and then rework on the supply chain mechanism. It is still a work in progress. However, as you mentioned, there is China pressure, and it could also be channelized into a border conflict in future or increase in conflict in the border areas. However, most important thing is the signaling that came from the United States. As you saw, the stock exchanges in India are rebounding. There is substantial, sentiment, partly because of the demographic advantages that we have, as has been mentioned already about the consumer base that India has, 400 million middle class that we have, and 59% of the consumption that we consume every year, and that is a good thing in terms of sustaining our growth rates and also absorbing the outside capital in the near future. So I think the fundamentals are strong, and including the Chinese, for example, the ICBC in China is now floating these appeals that India's growth rate is going to be about 8 to 9%, and then Chinese corporate sector should now shift over to the Indian growth rate market. So there is also the contrary signal from China to support or utilize the growth rates for its own benefit.
Absolutely. And what you're also telling us, Professor Kondapalli, is that economic weight, economic strength is sometimes a great security deterrent as well. Robinder, the final word on the show to you. For our viewers who have seen India's relationship evolve over the past several decades with the United States, it's very clear that a profound shift in the American approach is now underway with respect to China. Politically, and for the government of the day, Prime Minister Narendra Modi, what would be one of the perhaps the most important thing that they need to do to ensure that this American shift actually benefits us in a sustainable and long-term manner?
Thank you. A deep, deep question. I think one would be to keep the even keel and momentum of the country, our economic growth going. Because you see, whatever and wherever we are, it's due to our economy, our population multiplied by our productivity yielding our economy. That's what benefits America also when it wants India as a partner to counter China. Just imagine for a minute, if China was not there on the face of this planet, would the US be working as closely with us? I'm a great, believer and a friend of US-India relations. I doubt it, right? So China is the factor which is driving America. One track. The other track is we have a huge natural synergy with America, democracy, English, the Indian American community, and, free speech, etc., etc. Now, that said, the core thing is, I think, yes, for India to continue on its economic growth, invest heavily into R&D, uh, in terms of the supply chains. If I were to quickly mention, if you say China plus one strategy after COVID and all, not much has succeeded or come to India, honestly. I think Professor was mentioning Japan, or you were. In fact, the total number of Japanese companies in India in the last 5 years has gone down by one, from 1,455 or something like that, right? The opportunity for India right now, apart from others, is in this chip semiconductor game, because it seems that the US is much more serious now and putting its money where its mouth is. The US now realizes that China is racing ahead into leadership in AI, quantum, etc., and standards. The war of tomorrow is about whose standards would be adopted in technologies. So the opportunity now, as you were earlier mentioning in the show, that it's a fresh opportunity. Yes, I think manufacturing, supply chains, or whichever, I would say traditional, all other industries aside, the chips semiconductor game is something else altogether. This is where everybody is now focusing for multiple reasons, including national security. So that's where we have an advantage. American investments would come in. For us to work closer with the US, or rather the US to work closer with us, I think the more entangling alliances and partnerships we can have with America, especially in trade and manufacturing and in the industries of the future, will be better for India.
All right, that's a good point there. And even as I wrap up the show, viewers, just some news that's just come in. 255 eminent citizens have written to the President of India and the Chief Justice of India calling for strong action against a news portal with respect to some email exchanges and allegations of investments linked to Chinese entities. And the reason this is a bit significant is that a lot of geopolitics is also involved. But beyond the politics and beyond what the rhetoric that we hear in situations like this, it's very clear that India's movement to become a strong manufacturing base and an alternative for global capital is now upon us. China's economy is floundering, it is deflating. There are questions about President Xi Jinping's strategy and his long-term vision with regard to China's economy. And as you heard from the experts, and as Professor Kondapalli said, moving away from focusing on the economy to achieving something, the big question mark, what is China likely to achieve? There is very clearly an opportunity for India, and that's what is something that will benefit our country in the long run. Professor Kondapalli, Robinder, Sachdev, thank you very much for your time with us today. With that, it's a wrap on this episode of Easynomics. Viewers, we'll be back with more. Until then, goodbye.
Hello and welcome. You're watching BTTV. I'm Tanya Neja. Well, it's the earnings season and the company on our radar today is Biocon Biologics. Well, the company's revenue was recorded at 2015 odd crore rupees, and that was up around 106% from 977 odd crore rupees in the first quarter of the last year. But we have the management with us who will decode the earnings for us. We have with us Mr. Srikanth. He's the CEO and MD at Biocon Biologics. Thank you so much, sir, first of all, for taking the time out and joining us here on Business Today Television. Stellar set of numbers, but to help us understand,